So good morning everyone. This morning I'd like to first introduce the next shamatha practice that you'll be practicing later today with Felipe and again tomorrow morning. So remember, the shamatha practice is the practice of cultivating a calm, clear, focused mind, the practice to develop our attention skills. And so far we've been using the breath as the object for that practice. And that's the object that's probably most widely emphasized in most Buddhist traditions for this practice. But I'd like to introduce now the practice, the shamatha practice of observing the mind, which I think is particularly suitable or helpful for us in the modern world. So when we say using the mind as the object, what we're focusing on is, of course, the mind and whatever is arising in the mind. So we're observing our thoughts, our emotions, memories, mental images, and so forth. And of course, in this practice, we're just observing those as they arise and pass. Now, many of you will probably find this much more challenging than focusing on the breath for at least two reasons. One is the mind is a more subtle object than the breath, because the breath is a physical, tangible object. It's a little bit easier to focus on. But the second reason that many people find this challenging, of course, is that we don't have a habit of observing our thoughts and emotions and so forth. Our very strong habit is, as soon as something comes up in our mind, we latch onto it and off we go. We get caught up in our thoughts, emotions, memories, and so forth. And the other strong habit we have is that if something unpleasant comes up in our mind and we don't know how to deal with it, we simply try and stuff it back down. We try to suppress it. So that is our very strong habit, either following or suppressing. And of course, as a result of that, particularly in our modern world, we end up being tormented by our thoughts, emotions, and memories, and so forth. And we've ended up becoming the slaves of our own mind. So this practice, even though many of you maybe find it challenging, has enormous benefits. Because by simply being able to develop the ability to observe our thoughts, emotions, memories, and so forth as they arise and pass, without getting caught up in them, without needing to suppress them, we will become the masters of our own mind. Because actually, if you look at what a thought, emotion, or memory is from its own side, it's virtually nothing. They have no power to harm us whatsoever. Thoughts, emotions, and memories only have power to harm us if we give them power. And we give them power either by identifying with them and following them or trying to suppress them. Then they have a lot of power to harm us. But if we can just step back and watch them, they can't do anything to us. And of course, every time we can step back and watch, we're not feeding them, which means the habit of them coming up in the future will get less and less and less. So our mind over time will become naturally more quiet and still. And then in the future, if some strong mental event were to arise, we could be simply fully present with it without it overwhelming us. So we really will become the masters of our own mind through this practice. So just a couple more points about the actual practice before we go to the practice. So again, the object here is what's called the space of the mind and whatever mental events arise in this space. So mental events, of course, include thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images. So in this practice, what we're not focusing on is any sense objects. So we're not paying attention to any sounds, sensations, visual objects, smells, or tastes. Of course, these things will still come up. Sounds will still arise. Sensations will still arise. But we're not interested in them. Let them be there. We're not paying attention to them. And of course, in this practice, we're not trying to make the mind still. If you've ever tried to make your mind still, you know it doesn't work. That's suppressing. So whether there's thoughts there or not, both okay. If the mind is still, observe that stillness. If there's a lot of thoughts going on, observe that. And with this practice, it's very much recommended to have the eyes open. So before I mentioned that in general, the general recommendation is to have them slightly open to overcome sort of dullness. But particularly in this practice, it's very much recommended to have the eyes open, either naturally or partially, whichever works better for you. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is, of course, with the eyes open, helps to improve clarity of attention. With eyes closed, it's much easier to drift into dullness. But also, of course, it helps us to lock us more into the present moment. With the eyes closed, it's much easier to drift off into the past and the future. Another reason to have the eyes open in this practice is that also in daily life, we want to be able to observe our thoughts and emotions without getting caught up in them. But if we've only meditated with eyes closed, observing thoughts and emotions, then in daily life, when generally we have our eyes open, we're not in the habit of observing our thoughts and emotions with eyes open. So it's going to be more difficult to bring this into daily life. Whereas if we meditate with eyes open, then we're in the habit of observing thoughts and emotions with eyes open in meditation. It's going to be much easier to do the same then in daily life. And the last reason to have the eyes open in this practice is that with the eyes closed, there's really a strong sense that there's a me in here and a world out there. So there's this subject-object duality. Whereas we've briefly said already that the Buddhist view of reality is that there is no subject-object duality. Everything's interdependent. So if we meditate with the eyes open, then this false sense of duality is not as strong. It starts to break down a little bit, which is going to be very helpful later when we go into Vipassana practice to come to realize actually there is no duality. So for that reason also it's helpful to have the eyes open in this practice. When I say eyes open, again, just you can have them naturally or partially, whichever you prefer. And with eyes open, of course, we're not straining the eyes in any way. We're not trying to deliberately unfocus. We're not looking at anything. We're just resting our gaze in the space in front of us, and we're not trying to hold the eyes open, so blink as often as you need. So that's the practice we're going to do. Anything not clear about the practice before we jump in?
What's it called?
It's just, well, it's given many different names. It's just, sometimes it's called shamatha, using the mind. Sometimes Alan Wallace, in his book, calls it settling the mind in its natural state. So there's many other names for it, but the simple is just the shamatha, using the mind as the object.
If any thoughts come up, do you want us to just
Watch them.
watch them?
Watch them arise and pass. Don't follow them. Don't try and get rid of them. Don't do anything to them. We're just being like an impartial observer or witness, observing whatever's coming up and just watch it as it arises and passes. That's it. We're not trying to figure out where it came from, why it's there, what is it. This is not shamatha practice. That's vipassana. So we're not trying to figure out anything about what's there. We're just watching whatever's there. That's it.
What if it becomes a train of thought? Should we just let it be?
Well, generally a train of thought means a little bit we're caught up in it. So just let go of that grasping. Just let it go, let it go, let it go. Just keep releasing. Again, releasing doesn't mean try and push it away. Pushing it away is suppressing. Just release, just release. Just watch it as best you can.
How do we do it?
Sorry?
How do we do it?
How do you do it?
Yeah.
You just watch. Again, the thing is, as I mentioned, we don't have a habit of doing this. So what many of you will probably find is, as soon as something comes up, before you know it, you're off on a story. And it may be some minutes later you go, oh, hang on, I'm supposed to be watching this, not following. And then you let it go, and you come back, and then the next thing comes up, and off we go again, and maybe a couple of minutes later we go, oh, hang on, let go and come back. But that's where we start. I mean, that is the reality for most of us. That's what will happen. But that's okay, because that's where we are. But every time you let go, and it may be minutes later, you let go and come back, let go and come back. Instead of 2 minutes later, it'll be 1 minute, 30 seconds, 15 seconds, 5 seconds, and then you'll notice you're starting to go, you let go, and eventually you'll be able to just watch. But it'll take time. So just be patient.
Should we fix our gaze at a particular point and not let it wander?
Okay, again, in general, with the eyes open, we're not looking at anything. It's a little bit like sometimes in daily life, we're caught up in some sort of daydream. And often we have our eyes open, but we're not looking at anything when we're caught up in a daydream. So it's a little bit like that. We are focusing on observing the thoughts and we're not really looking at anything. But a little thing that we can do as a beginner here is that many of us, our visual gaze dominates everything else. And therefore, particularly if there's something around us that there's movement, we just follow it. So if you find that you are looking at different movement, as a temporary measure, you can pick like a spot on the floor in front of you and use that as a little bit of an anchor point. It's better to focus there than allow your eyes to look at all sorts of things, because then we're just caught up in distraction. But of course, ideally, not even that. But that's better than looking around at everything. So when you're at home, of course, doing this practice, you can just have like a blank wall in front of you, so there's nothing for you to attract your attention. But as a temporary measure here, if you find that you're just looking at all sorts of things, pick a spot. Okay, let's do the practice, so we'll do 15 minutes.
How can you differentiate between letting go and suppressing?
How do you know between letting go and suppressing? To have the idea that to have this sort of, it's okay if it's there, it's okay if it's not. To have no preference. If you have no preference for mind being still or lots of thoughts, or good thoughts or bad thoughts or whatever, if you have no preference, that's the key. As soon as we have a preference, then of course if something unpleasant comes up, we're going to be doing this. And if something pleasant comes up, we're going to be doing this. So just have no preference. If the mind is still, great. If it's nice things coming up, great. If it's bad things coming up, great. All good. If we do that, then we'll find it less suppressing and less caught up.
So letting go by letting be?
Yeah. Letting go is, here in this practice we let be. In the breath practice we had to let go of thoughts. Here we just let them be. So let them be just means watch them as they arise and pass. Okay? Let's do the practice. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Not trying to control or regulate the breath in any way. Simply allowing it to flow naturally and effortlessly. And setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. And simply becoming aware of the rhythm of the breath. Now allow the eyes to be at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. Blink as often as you need. And now bring your attention to your own mind and observe your own mind and whatever is arising in the space of the mind. Thoughts, emotions, memories, images. Simply be like an impartial observer or witness, observing thoughts and other mental events as they arise and pass, without following them, without trying to get rid of them. If you're new to this practice and you're not sure where to focus, then every now and again deliberately generate a thought. Any thought will do. And watch that thought as it arises in your mind. And watch it as it disappears back into the mind. And then keep your attention right where it was and see what comes up next in that space. find that you've got caught up in a thought and got carried away, remember the first thing to do is simply relax. Then release grasping onto that thought and very gently return to observing the mind. So relax, release and return. Every time you get distracted. And if you're finding that you're constantly getting distracted, then you might like to experiment with labeling or noting to help stabilize your attention. That is, give a name to whatever arises in your mind, such as thought, memory, image, emotion. And that way you can have some space from it and not so easily get caught up in it. If you're getting frustrated at not being able to observe your thoughts, observe that frustration. Or if you're getting bored with the practice, observe that boredom. Whatever is arising in the mind, observe it. Just a few more comments about that practice. When we start this practice, one of the most common experiences is that we're constantly swept away, carried away by our thoughts and emotions. As soon as something comes up, before we know it, we're off. Because that's our strong habit. So what to do in that case? So of course, as with all distractions, the standard response is first relax, i.e. don't get frustrated and upset. Then release grasping onto that thought and just return to observing the mind. So as per normal, just relax, release, return. Just keep coming back. What we introduced in that meditation briefly is a short-term strategy in case we're just constantly swept away to help us to get into the practice. That is this idea of labelling or noting, meaning give a name to the mental event. Like something comes up, thought, image, memory, frustration, anger. Give a name to it. But make it simple and don't give a label about what that is about. Don't go thought about such and such, anger about such and such, because then we're still caught up. Just label the event itself, i.e. is it a thought, an emotion, frustration, image, memory, without labelling the content. But again, this is you're adding something. So this is not part of the standard practice, but it may be useful in the short term if you're just getting constantly swept away to help you to be a bit more stabilised. Just like in the breath practice, we introduce the idea of counting as a short-term strategy to help us, but eventually in that we'd have to let go of counting. Similarly here, once we get more into the practice, we'll have to let go of this because this is adding something, but you may find it useful initially. Another short-term strategy you may find helpful if you're just getting swept away is to anchor in the breath. Meaning if you're just constantly getting caught up in your thoughts and so forth, go back into the body and focus on the breath. For this, the rhythm of the breath is very good. So just focus on the breath, have that as your main object, and then a little bit in the corner of your mind, notice your thoughts and so forth. That way you have an anchor. And then over time, less emphasis on the breath, more on the thoughts, and then eventually let go of the breath altogether. So you can sort of transition, holding that breath as an anchor point. Then the fourth thing we can do is what we introduced at the beginning of the practice, is that every so often generate a thought. Because sometimes we get into this practice and we're just constantly swept away and we sort of get disheartened thinking, oh, I can't do this at all. Because generally, thoughts don't announce themselves. They don't say, here I come, be ready. Before you know it, they're there, and before we know it, we're gone. Whereas if we're generating a thought, we know it's coming, so we can be ready. And so we can watch it as that thought comes up in the mind and watch it as it disappears back in the mind. So we can have a bit of feeling of success. You know, I can do this a little bit. But again, we're adding something. So these three are just short-term strategies that may help us to get into the practice. But once we get into the practice, any one of those we'll have to let go of. So that's the most common experience and what we can do. But sometimes there's another experience that's quite common in the beginning stages. And that is we sit down and we look and suddenly there's nothing there. There's no thoughts. And unfortunately, as a beginner, that's not usually because our mind has suddenly become very quiet and still. The main reason is that our focus is too intense. Just like in daily life, when we want to focus on something, we tense, and here we know we just get swept up, so we'll have this habit that if I want to watch, I have to really do that intensely, otherwise I'm just going to slip away. So that's what we do, we have this intense focus. And if we do that, of course we're suffocating the mind, there's no space for anything to come up. So if you notice your focus is intense, you need to relax, 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 relax. Another reason why we don't seem to often see much is we're simply lacking clarity. Like maybe some of you, when we did the focusing at the nostrils, maybe you didn't notice any sensations there. But that's not because there wasn't any sensations, it's because our mind wasn't clear enough. So similarly here, if our mind is very dull, then probably we're not going to notice anything. You remember the threshold, our threshold is way up. So there's a lot of things going on, but we don't notice it because our mind is dull. So if you notice that you're dull, then sharpen the focus. Another thing that often happens is we sit down and we look and we go, there's no thoughts. What's going on? Normally my mind is very active and busy, but now it's gone completely quiet and still. I think I must be doing this wrong. I don't know what I'm doing here. There's nothing there. This is all thoughts. So whatever comes up, watch it. And then the last point is, if there's really no thoughts there, observe that space, that stillness, and just see what comes up next in that space. It's not switch off. So that's some things we can do if we have no thoughts. Any questions before we move on to this morning's topic?
Intellectually, I know that the mind is clear, and the stage at where I am now, thoughts will pop up. But experientially, I could not follow the fourth point, observe the space. It felt like the mind is not there when the thoughts are not there.
Right. So, again, the mind is not really a thing. It's the space within which, that's what clarity means. Clarity means it's the space within which everything appears. So if you're looking for a thing, the mind, you'll never find that. So just rest in that space where everything is appearing. That is the mind.
Please explain number 2 again, lacking clarity.
Yeah, lacking clarity is just like often when we start to focus on the breath here, often we don't notice anything. But again, that's not because there's no sensations there, it's because our mind is not clear, it's quite dull. There is sensation, so we just need to sharpen the focus without tensing. So similarly here, if our mind is quite dull, then there's a lot of things probably going on, but we're not noticing them. So we just need to sharpen our attention, to pay closer attention without tension, of course. But this takes practice.
Exactly that. I don't quite understand how to do that.
Just pay closer attention. It's like if you're looking, let's say you're looking at something, but you're sort of looking very sort of lazy, but it's something very small, then we may not notice it. What do? We just pay closer attention, don't we? We look closely. So that's all it is. It's just look more closely. Look more closely for sensations. Look more closely at the mind, without tensing, of course.
What do you know if you're observing the thought or just...
So what's the difference between observing a thought and thinking a thought? Big difference. Let's say we're thinking about these flowers. When we're thinking about the flowers, what are we focusing on? Flowers. If we're observing a thought about the flowers, what are we observing? Thought. So if you are engaging in the contents, you're caught up.
Can you explain number 4, generate a thought?
Yeah. So again, this would be only if we completely lost in the practice, we don't know where to focus. It's just generate a thought. Just bring a thought to mind, anything. It could be an image, it could be a memory, it could be a thought, anything. And when you do that, just watch it as it's coming up, and then watch it as it disappears again. That's all.
While I try to look closely to the thought, I become so intense.
Yeah, that's normal. So then we relax. So that's what's going to happen, is if we're too intense, what we do is we relax and we just go to dullness. Then we're too dull, we sharpen, and we get intense. So that's our daily life. Either we're focused and intense, or we're relaxed and dull. So what we're doing is we're probably doing this, but hopefully if we fine-tune, instead of doing this, we'll go and then end up in the middle eventually. So it's just a matter of adjusting. And if we keep adjusting, then hopefully we'll eventually find the balance in the middle, where we're relaxed and alert at the same time. But this will take time to develop this.
What do you mean we observe this?
Again, just the stillness. When there's no thoughts, what do you see? No thoughts. But it's still, yeah? It's not like you pass out, is it? There's still awareness there, isn't there? So just stay in that experience. That's it.
Initially, how do we distinguish resting from dullness? How do you distinguish resting from dullness?
What's the first word? Something from dullness? What?
Resting.
Resting.
Yeah.
Resting. If we're resting, it should be still our mind should be very clear. Very clear. Meaning if something comes, we notice it. When we're dull, something comes, we don't notice it. Okay. So let's go to, you'll practice this again later today with Felipe and again tomorrow morning, and so we'll get to practice this much more. So let's go to today's topic. So we're using the Four Noble Truths as the framework for all of our discussions. And remember, the first two Noble Truths was the Buddha's diagnosis for us. The first Noble Truth, of course, the truth of suffering or dukkha, was what condition do we find ourselves in, this state of dukkha? What is the underlying cause of that? Is the second Noble Truth, the cause or origin of suffering or dukkha. And we saw there yesterday that why are we stuck in this state of dukkha or suffering is because of our mental afflictions. Particularly at the deepest level, it's our distorted view of reality. It's this grasping onto independent me, independent world that leads to attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things. That leads to all the other mental afflictions that's driving our behaviour. And every action we do based on a mental affliction has a result, and the result are our experiences. So that was the Buddha's diagnosis for us, that we're stuck in this state because of our mental afflictions, at the deepest level, our distorted view of reality. And then, of course, the Buddha's prognosis was that we can be cured, we can transcend, we can be liberated from all suffering and its causes. So that was that third Noble Truth, the truth of cessation, the ending of all suffering and its causes. And the fourth Noble Truth was the cure, the Buddha's cure. What practices do we need to engage in to achieve that state of freedom from suffering? And that was, we're going to talk more about that, the Noble Eightfold Path, which can be condensed into those three core areas of practice. The basis of course, is ethics, avoiding harmful behaviour. On that basis, we engage in the concentration practice, the shamatha practice, develop single point of concentration. On that basis, we enter into the wisdom of vipassana practice to gain an insight into the nature of reality so that we can overcome ignorance, mental afflictions and suffering. So therefore, these are the Four Noble Truths, and the Buddha said that suffering, the first Noble Truth, is to be known. The cause of suffering is to be eliminated or abandoned. Cessation is to be attained, and the path is to be cultivated. And so we saw yesterday there that in the diagnosis is that what is the process of how our distorted view of reality leads to mental afflictions and the suffering, the dukkha, is we use this suffering and its causes chart. So what I'd like to do is go back to that now and have a look at it again. So maybe we can just briefly go through the points again to have it clear in our mind. Because what I'd like to do now is that yesterday we said that the long-term strategy, how to overcome suffering, it was to eliminate the underlying cause, this ignorance. And we do that through this vipassana practice of emptiness, which we're going to talk a lot about in detail day after tomorrow. But while we're working on that, then it would be good to have together with that long-term strategy, to have a short-term strategy that we can implement right now to help at least reduce the impact of this process. So that's what I'd like to look at now. But before we do that, just to review the steps so we have them clear in our mind. So remember the first step here, seed of ignorance, This ignorance again was grasping to independent me, independent world. And seed means habit. And we've had that habit since we were born and well before. And every time we look out on the world, everything appears to exist completely independent of us. So there seems to be this subject-object duality. But this view of reality in Buddhism is saying this is not how things exist. So this appearance, this what's called dualistic appearance, is deceiving us. So it's called mistaken dualistic appearance. Everything has always appeared to us in this way. We've never seen things in another way. So there's no reason to question appearances. So we never do. And since we have the habit of believing that, we just accept. We just grasp. Yes, me here, world there. So we're step 2. And every time we experience something, we have this mental factor of feeling, which is experiencing things as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And again, we use this example of the flower. When we see the flower, it appears to exist independent of us. We have the habit of believing that. We just accept. Yep, there's some flowers there. I'm in no way contributing to the existence of those flowers. And if we have a pleasant experience when we see those flowers, together with this belief that those flowers are independent of us, will naturally lead us to assume there must be some attractive quality there that's causing my pleasant feeling. So we'll see these flowers as inherently attractive or attractive from their own side. And according to Buddhism, this is a misconception. And similarly, if we have an unpleasant experience, together with the belief that flowers are independent of us, we'll naturally assume there must be some unattractive quality there that's causing the unpleasant feeling. So we'll see them as inherently unattractive, or neutral feeling, inherently neutral. And once we get to step 3, then, of course, step 4 easily follows. Because I like pleasant experiences, I want pleasant experiences, those flowers seem to be causing my pleasant experience, I want those flowers. Attachment. Or if it's unpleasant experience, I don't like that, I don't want it, those flowers seem to be causing my unpleasant experience, get them out of here, aversion. Or if it's a neutral experience, just reinforcing a mistaken belief that those flowers are independent of us, ignorance, although here we often, instead of the word ignorance, we have the word confusion, same meaning. So here we have the 3 poisons, all other mental afflictions come out of those, that's what's driving our behaviour. And we saw yesterday afternoon, the Buddhist assertion is there is a law of causality operating here in terms of our actions versus then leading to our various experiences of dukkha. So this is the process, and we saw also that why do things appear to exist independent of us when they don't exist like that? Again, it's because of ignorance. That ignorance, it stains the mind with what's called latency of ignorance. Remember we used that analogy of the clove of garlic, that you put the garlic in the bowl, even if you take the garlic out, the garlic stained the bowl with the smell. A little bit like that. Ignorance stains our mind. And what that stain does is that when we come into contact with an object, that object appears to exist completely independent of us. So what we saw there yesterday was that the long-term solution to overcoming mental afflictions and suffering was to go to the underlying cause, ignorance, our distorted view of reality. And we eliminate this, of course, as we saw in this quote from Nagarjuna, the last line, he says, elaborations, which is another name for ignorance, will cease through cultivating emptiness. And emptiness is the realization that nothing exists independently. There's no independent me, no independent world. Once we come to realize that, we'll overcome that distorted view, thereby overcome mental afflictions and suffering, and achieve liberation. But that could take quite some time to do that. So while we're working on that, then it would be helpful to have an effective short-term strategy to help us to reduce the impact of this process. So that's what I'd like to look at now. What can we do right now to at least reduce the impact of this process? And I already mentioned one thing earlier is, let's say even before step 1, what can we do even before step one was that as part of an effective short-term strategy would be that if, and we saw that in terms of these 6 factors yesterday that lead to mental afflictions, was the fact that media and society can have a very heavy negative impact on us. And therefore to be discerning about who we meet and what we read and so forth in the media. So therefore, as part of an effective short-term strategy, if there are certain situations or people that whenever we encounter them, we always react in a negative way, then there's no point in unnecessarily going into those situations. So then to, as best as possible, to give yourself some space and from those situations, to step back from those situations. Of course, running away from difficult situations is never a long-term solution, but it could be very good as part of an effective short-term strategy to step back, to work on ourselves so that later we can enter into those difficult situations, and if it's a difficult person, maybe even help that person. So that is something we can do even before step one. But let's now start with step one. So let's say we've come into contact with a person or an object. It's appearing to exist completely independent of us. We have the habit of believing that. Can we do anything at step one now to avoid accepting that? Anything at all, or nothing to do?
Can you repeat the question, please?
So we're at step one. So we've come into contact with a thing or a person. It appears to exist completely independent of us. We have the habit of believing that. Can we do something to stop grasping onto that as existing independent of us?
Love and compassion.
No. That won't work here. Maybe that'll work down here, but not here. Anyone got any ideas?
Find things that don't separate us, or things that are common to us between us?
I think again that might be useful down here. Anyone got any ideas?
Just awareness of it.
In what sense?
Like being, like thinking about contemplating and
Contemplating what though?
contemplating your thoughts, being aware of the thoughts, like with meditation.
Right, but simply being aware of it, I don't think that's going to counteract the fact of believing or seeing it existing independent. I mean, being aware is great, and actually this is going to be one of the strategies down here, but there's something extra we need to...
Recognizing the
No expectations.
Expectations, again, that's more down here, I think.
recognizing the thing which kicks off the
What does that mean?
identifying the problem before it kicks off. Right? Suppose
Well, there's no problem here yet.
the trigger.
Yeah, but there's no problem here yet.
To see the trigger.
No, the problem starts down here. We're pre-problem. But we're setting ourselves up to have problems. But what can we do even at this early stage?
Have a plan.
Plan.
So plan what could happen in this situation.
Yeah, I think this is more down here still.
Okay.
Before that.
If you want to hold on to that object, hold it with awareness, and step by step, mindfully, do it mindfully.
Yeah, this again down here. So all of these strategies are good, but they're all later. We need to do something before this.
We need to cultivate meditation and wisdom so we can put it throughout our daily lives.
We can...
Cultivate meditation and wisdom to put it throughout our daily lives. Therefore, we're establishing it as a starting point.
You're right, and then what in particular in wisdom? I'm looking for something specific.
It's the idea of we're none of us independent causes.
Yeah. So I think that's where we're getting to the point now, is that to do something at step one, we need to first start to understand the Buddhist view of reality, the idea that nothing exists independently, that everything's interdependent. But the only way we're going to start to gain conviction in that is if we meditate on that and we start to have some taste or experience in meditation which confirms to us that actually things are not as they do not exist as they appear. Because if we have an intellectual understanding plus we have some experience of that in meditation, then we'll have quite strong conviction, things are not actually existing as they appear. And if we get there, then we can do something here. Because then we can start to question appearances. But if we don't have that, we'll never question appearances. In fact, we'll just say, well, of course it's existing independent of me. So if we start to develop this view of emptiness, which we're going to talk a lot about, and plus meditate to have some experience of that, we'll start to gain a strong conviction that things are not existing as they appear. And then we can begin to question appearances. That as soon as something appears to us, and it appears so much that it's existing independent of us, we'll go, hang on, based on my understanding and my experience of meditation, things are not existing like that. Then we can at least, because this here is the actual grasping. So then if we do that, we can at least reduce the grasping. Maybe not eliminate it completely, but at least not strongly grasp onto things existing independent. So that's already going to weaken the likelihood of that process going further.
The other day you said, you gave the example of flowers,
Yep.
saying, talking about beauty.
Right.
So you compared like what is beauty for you and for somebody else, right?
Yeah.
So if you meditate, and meditation is something personal, right? How is it going to change that? I mean, the other person meditates and I meditate by myself. How is it going to work that we are not going to see different things?
Sure, you'll see different things. Of course. None of us see the same thing. I mean, even though we're all here and we all look there, I mean, we can say there's 100 different experiences going on. I mean, maybe some of them are very similar, but they're unique. Everyone has different experiences, of course. We're not trying to have all the same experience, but whatever our experiences are, to come to an understanding of how that thing we're experiencing exists. We're not trying to make everyone have the same experience. We're just trying to come to a correct understanding of the thing we're experiencing, how that exists, that's all. Okay. But let's say we did manage to do that and we got down to step 2. So now we're grasping. Independent me, independent whatever it is we're experiencing. And we're experiencing whatever it is, and we're having this, we're either experiencing it as pleasant, unpleasant or neutral. What can we do at step 2 to avoid going to step 3 and 4? Right now. Have a plan. What's the plan? Tell me your plan.
Imagine the situation and a positive outcome and a negative outcome and what your reactions would be, and then what you could do in both of those situations to come to the place that you want to.
Right, that's good, but again, I think this is more down here. So we can do something even before that plan. Plan is good, but before we do the plan, something can help before that.
Reminding ourselves that the object doesn't have the inherent properties of
That's the
pleasant.
third step.
Okay.
Let it pass.
What do you mean?
Gut feeling came, you let it pass.
Very good, excellent. So, those of you who, of course, have done a Goenka retreat know this very well. What is one of the main things Goenka said in the retreat? Just observe, just observe, just observe. That's all we have to do. And this second step is very much emphasized, particularly in the Theravada Buddhist traditions, as an excellent point to break the process. But to be able to just observe, we need mindfulness. If we haven't strengthened our mindfulness through shamatha practice, we can try to just observe as much as we want, but before we know it, we'll be down here, caught up in mental afflictions and saying and doing things that we're going to regret. Then it's too late. So, as we saw yesterday, that there is a very small window of opportunity we have from when a stimulus comes until we're reacting. That window may only be a second or two. And if we don't have mindfulness, we're not going to catch that window. Before we know it, we're already caught up in craving, and jealousy, aversion, anger, hatred, and then it's too late. We're out of control. But if we strengthen our mindfulness through shamatha practice, regardless of whether we're observing the breath, the mind, or any other object in shamatha, it doesn't matter, we are strengthening mindfulness, which means then in daily life we'll be more present with whatever's arising. So when we have contact to some object or person and we start to have this pleasant or unpleasant experience, we can just observe that. We can just notice that pleasant or unpleasant experience or feeling arise and pass. And then that will cut the process. We won't go to the third and fourth step. But let's say we didn't manage to do that, and now we're at step 3. So now we've come into contact, we've either had, say, a pleasant or unpleasant experience, and now that personal thing is looking so attractive or so unattractive from its own side. What can we do at step 3 to avoid going to step 4?
Just on the previous one, sorry. Right in the morning, your awareness and focus is not as strong. So your ability to observe is not as focused. As soon as you wake up, so you tend to get drifted in thoughts much more. Is there any strategy that you recommend? Like right as you wake up and you're slightly groggy and not as focused?
Well, there's a lot to say about that, and I'll talk more about that later. But a brief thing is, of course, unfortunately, one of the main reasons we're groggy in the morning is we just don't get enough sleep. I mean, we just simply don't get enough sleep. We never have enough time for everything. So what we do is we cut sleep from 8 to 7 to 6 to 5 to 4 hours. And somehow we manage to get by, but this is not a good idea. Because we're damaging the body and we won't be able to meditate, and it's just really bad news all around. So the first strategy, of course, is make sure we get enough good sleep. And then you'll find, actually, if you do, you'll often find that when you wake up, actually that's often when you're most sharp and clear in the morning, if you get enough sleep. If you don't, of course, you're going to be very groggy and all sorts of things. And also, one other thing, and then we'll talk more about later, is when you get up, it's always good to set a good motivation for the day. Because otherwise we start jumping off into all the things we're going to do that day. So if you set a good motivation, that's going to be very helpful as well. But more will come later. So, yeah, we're at step 3. So we've seen a personal thing. We're having a pleasant or unpleasant experience. That personal thing is looking so attractive or unattractive from its own side. Can we do anything there to avoid going to step 4? Anything at all?
Remind ourselves how attachment works.
How
attachment works, that we exaggerate attractiveness.
Right, but we're talking about before attachment. So this is probably useful when attachments come in, but before that.
You don't have any inherent attractiveness?
So I didn't hear what?
Remember that objects don't have any inherent
attractiveness. Again, if we have reflected on this view of emptiness and meditated and really come to conviction that things are not existing as they appear, then that will also mean that we'll have conviction there's no beauty there, there's no ugliness there from its own side. And if we have that, then even though it looks so attractive from its own side, we'll know from our understanding and experience, actually that's not true. And that can help reduce attachment and aversion. But if we haven't studied and meditated on this view of emptiness, then that's not going to be possible. We'll go straight to here. So let's say we've got to here then. Now some attachment, aversion or whatever is arising. What can we do here to avoid going to step 5? Any ideas? So some attachment, some mental affliction is arising. What can we do?
Can you explain step 3 again, what to do?
So at step 3, step 3 is we've come into contact with a personal thing, and let's say we're having either a pleasant or unpleasant, and that personal thing is looking so attractive or so unattractive from their own side. Can we do something there to stop having attachment or aversion? And the answer is, we can, but only if we understand that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And not just intellectually, because most of us often probably have that intellectual understanding. I'm talking experiential. So if we have studied about this view of emptiness, we've meditated and had a little taste that things really are not existing as they appear, then we'll have some strong conviction that things are not as they appear. So then, even though it appears so attractive from its own side, we'll know from our understanding and experience that's not how it is. Then we can question that and we'll go, there's no beauty there. Beauty's not there to be found. But again, let's say we're at step 4. Some attachment, aversion, or some mental affliction is arising. What can we do at step 4 to avoid going to step 5? Sorry? Count to 3. That can help. Just sort of take a few deep breaths.
Maybe to put some limits or boundaries, like of using the things or being with a person. To understand that you don't need it that much.
Sure, but there's something even more simple. Just watch it, you mean?
Yeah, recognize and watch it.
Just observe. Just observe. Easy. Well, simple, but not easy. I mean, it's so simple. I mean, it's not something, we don't have to do anything complicated. It's not some complicated thing. We just watch. And it's not easy because we don't have a habit. It's so simple. All we need to do is just train. And so, particularly the shamatha practice we did this morning, if we do that as our shamatha practice, you'll find this becomes a lot easier. Because you'll notice, because we're actually observing, this is the shamatha practice we did this morning, is observing not only our thoughts, but our mental afflictions, our memories, all of that. Just getting in the habit of observing them as they arise and pass. So if we do particularly that shamatha practice, then in daily life, we're going to notice that. We're going to notice some craving and attachment rising early, and we'll go, oh, that's interesting. Look at that. And of course, if we can watch the mental affliction, we're no longer focusing on the thing that's feeding it. So there's nothing feeding it. So it can't go anywhere. And actually, if we're watching the attachment, we're free of it. We're not caught up in it. We don't have to fight with it. We don't have to try and get rid of it. We don't have to do anything to it. We just watch it, and it has nowhere, it can't go anywhere. It will just go, and it'll pass. So that is also very effective, yeah.
I was going to say, the thing is some of the attachments might come from other people or social situations, so really then it's not feasible to just stand or sit and observe. Like, you have to temporarily remove yourself from the situation and then observe it.
Right, but exactly. So you're right, as a beginner, one is we're probably not going to observe any situation attachment, but certainly even if we develop a little bit the ability to do that, when some strong stimulus comes, we won't be able to observe it. So you're right, when some strong stimulus comes and this comes up and we're already a little bit out of control, we have to get out of there fast before we say and do things we're going to regret. But what you will find is that if we continue to develop this ability to observe in meditation, practice we did this morning, you'll find that even in very strong situations, you'll be able to catch that very early, and actually you'll be able to stay calm. But that'll take time. But there will be a time where whatever the situation is, we'll be able to stay there and present. But of course, as an effective short-term strategy in difficult, heavy situations, probably still will need to get out of there.
Sometimes for sensitive people, like emotion does not come from like ourselves. It can come from other people.
Sorry, you lost me.
Say like it happened to me. Some people have some strong emotion and
some anger. So they gave you their anger.
Not anger, like regret.
Regret. So they gave you your regret.
Yes.
Impossible.
They haven't.
Impossible.
They haven't.
What? No, it's impossible. What they can do is be a strong effect for regret to arise in your mind, and it seems like they're the cause of your regret, but it's not possible. It's not possible. What we often say is, they made me angry. They're the cause of my anger. Not possible. They can be a condition for anger or regret or jealousy to arise in our mind, and it seems like they gave us anger, but it's impossible. We have to accept. We caused that to arise because we have the habit. They were the condition for anger or regret or whatever to arise in our mind, not the cause. Big difference. Okay. So we can observe here, but there's something we can do in addition to this, but I see now it's time for morning tea break. So let's break there for morning tea. Come back at 10:45, and I want to finish these step 4, 5 and 6.